Hello and welcome to this month's Industry Insights. I am your host, Leah Troscianecki. General, you might say. We'll explain that in just a minute. And I am joined today by somebody who is definitely not a scruffy-looking nerf herder, my good friend, our field CISO of Coveware, Ray Umerley. Ray, thank you so much for joining the show again.
Leah, always a pleasure, especially when we get to play with these themes. I mean, I think this is going to be a great episode, especially for Halloween. So
absolutely, it is going to be a great episode for Halloween. When we were talking about this month's episode, making it all cybersecurity themed for Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and of course, capstoning it at the end of the month, Ray and I couldn't help but say, is this the time that we go ahead and dress up and bring out all of our fun regalia? Now, Ray, you have more than a closet full of this stuff. Do you want to share with the audience a bit about your background with the Star Wars universe?
I'll take 30 seconds on this, but so I am a member of the 501st Legion Costuming Club. That's the official Star Wars costuming club. Been a member for 10 years now, but I have about 15 approved costumes at this point. Everything from Darth Maul to Kylo Ren, and then of course I throw a Rebel in my closet now and then as well. So it's a passion project, but I really enjoy the kids' faces when we go to the hospitals and the different charity fundraisers, and it's a great way to bring that fandom forward. So.
Shocking no one, I did a lot of children's theater growing up. I played Minnie Mouse for 3 years, so I know what it's like to delight the kids. But of course, growing up with the name Leah, you can't help but be a massive Star Wars fan. I have to say, though, I had to reach out to my nerd friends and get some really strong advice because I had to make a big decision. It was time to go ahead and make a big purchase. So with that, I would like to debut for everyone my lightsaber. I'm very excited.
And the right color as well.
So. And it is the right color. This is, in fact, General Leia Organa's lightsaber. And yes, if you're wondering, this is a very cool sound effect. It has buttons. Highly recommend. Because we're over here, we're just trying to do very important work here. Of course, we all have fun here, but I think it's really important to note that, there was a recent report that came out from the Coveware team, your Q3 cybersecurity report of tactics, techniques, and procedures. So we want to dive into that. But first, I want to get everybody in the mindset of what it means to put your defenses up and think critically about those areas of weakness. So for our poll question today, I know I normally like to talk about, ballpark food and other fun icebreaker questions, but I figured for this one, it makes sense to dive right into a little bit of that rebellious spirit. So if your cyber defense were a rebellion, what would be its weakness? Do you feel like your organization has blind trust in old defenses? I think most do. Is there a single point of failure? I mean, you can't think of a more perfect example of a single point of failure than that fatal Death Star plan that, of course, hinged on collecting a backup. If anyone's watched the extended movie series. Is it a lack of intelligence sharing? Of course, as General Organa over here, I am well familiar with the intelligence network. Or is it an over-reliance on tools instead of teamwork? Something that, Han Solo might know a little bit about, because I think he was a little too focused on his ship and not enough focused on being on a team sometimes. But he came around in the end, right?
Well, I mean, come on. It is a great ship, though. So
it is a great ship. I think that was the whole plot of episode 7, wasn't it? Was just marveling at being at the ship.
Yeah. Honestly, it is one of those things, like, I can't think of Han Solo without the Millennium Falcon, and I think vice versa. So, yeah.
And I should point out, we were supposed to also be joined by a good friend of the show, Charles Clarke. And he's very upset to not be here because he had an amazing Chewbacca costume. We were going to have Chewie. We were going to round out the team on this show. But he was called upon for an urgent mission with one of our customers far off in the galaxy. So we wish him all the best. And I did make him promise to join another show. He asked if May the 4th was available. I'm sure it is, but
I was going to say maybe Life Day. That's coming up around the corner too. So, we can't forget that one. Yes.
Okay. That's what we'll pin him on because he cannot get away. All right. So we're going to hold him to it. That's what the team is all about. And Chewie likes to mess around, but ultimately he needs to be with his buddy Han Solo. So I love it so much. Well, keep letting us know in the chat from wherever you're tuning in from. We live stream from multiple platforms. And if you're catching the recording afterwards, still comment and let us know where you think your defenses are weakest. Because today we're going to talk a lot about kind of, what we're seeing in tactics, techniques, and procedures. We've got this really great Cove War report we're going to show you. We're also going to talk a bit about Microsoft's own report, which is one of my favorites to take a look at. So we're going to start there with our first episode 1, The Menace Within. That's a teaser for the Cove War report, of course. But before I get to that, one of the things I wanted to talk about is this Microsoft Digital Defense Report. If you don't look at this report ever, I highly recommend it. This is a report that Microsoft publishes every single year, and it is pretty extensive and pretty eye-opening. And there's a whole host of information in there that can really help all of us who are ingrained in the Microsoft community, which, spoiler alert, is pretty much anyone who isn't on open source technology. So a couple of interesting insights I saw from their report. Microsoft reports that its customers face over 600 million cyber attacks per day. I mean, it is a flooding the zone tactic. I think I saw somewhere else in the report that there were something like 3,800 unique organizations that they were able to identify as part of their report. And I'm sure that there's a plethora more beyond that. They just weren't necessarily able to triangulate everyone. And part of that is a significant portion of attack paths involve lateral movements from non-sensitive to sensitive entities, especially via identity compromise. And Ray, part of why I wanted to start with this is on our next show, we're actually going to talk all about identity threats specifically and really zone in on this. So I figured it was a good place to start here. Ray, when you guys are working with organizations and, taking a look at remediation and planning for steps ahead, how do you think about identity as a place to start?
So I think it's critical. So a couple things about this information I just want to kind of tee off. The 600 million, I think one of the things that highlights for a lot of security teams and individuals listening, there's a huge amount of noise and a little bit of signal in here. When we think about all the different inbound threats to a network and to devices and so forth, this is pushing a rope uphill for a lot of teams because it's coming literally from everywhere. Now, much of that is probably being deflected. It's not getting in. But where it's been most impactful is, to your point, when it leads to compromise of identity. Why? Well, identity has really become the new breach. It's not so much about, well, it is, but it isn't, about the data and the disruption. It often hinges off that identity component. So when we think about mature enterprises, those with tightened defenses, those who have good vulnerability management, those who maybe even have multi-factor authentication on all their endpoints, it still comes down to a lot of factors now using tactics like social engineering to try to get my credentials because I'm already inside the organization, or take advantage of the fact that I'm already in and logged in and use that to get further in by having me authorize an application or doing something with my authenticated identity. So it's very, very important as we think about this, and we're going to talk a little bit later too about zero trust, why identity is so critical, because it is the keystone that oftentimes leads to many of these attacks. And to the point here, it'll start off with my workstation or my mobile device or wherever, and then start to quickly move from that point to another point until it gets to those sensitive pieces of our infrastructure, sensitive applications and so forth. And that's where the real damage occurs.
And I think that kind of entry point piece, speaking to the social engineering angle, I know that every report has said that continues to be one of the most prevalent ways that these bad actors are able to get in. Internally at Veeam, we actually recently did a series with a consensual doxing organization to educate everyone on what doxing looks like. And I was actually the lucky volunteer to get to be consensually doxed. And it was quite funny because normally they said that they try to pick someone like Dave Smith. So to have such a bizarre last name as mine was fun. But I actually have taken a lot of the right steps to obfuscate my identity, and I've deleted certain social media platforms. So I made it a hard hunt for them. And even then, the things that they were able to build out about my life and identify really specific details just from social media, let alone opportunities on the black market, it just goes to show that you have to assume breach with everything you do. especially when it comes to identity. And something we're going to talk about in the next show is not only does that become a vulnerability point, but it's also the central context for everything we do. When you think about architecting zero trust, we're going to talk about that on this show. It starts with identity. It starts with that context. And if that at all gets compromised, which the Microsoft Digital Defense Report shows absolutely happens in these kinds of attacks, you have to take a look at what your recovery plan would look like for that critical context. So definitely a lot to parse out here. Ray, any last thoughts on this piece before we move on to the Coveware report?
I think on the doxing one, and this is one of the reasons I'm so much fun at cocktail parties, the other thing to talk about is AI. Because I often get asked, how has artificial intelligence, large language models changed cyber attacks? And we can always go into very well crafted, emails now for phishing attempts or voice manipulation or deepfakes. But also, if you go back into the way of actually identifying social engineering targets, it used to take possibly days or weeks to kind of map out an organization and so forth and put together profiles of people that you would then use for your social engineering attacks. I can do that in a matter of minutes now with a simple AI engine. So the deception at scale and speed of deception has increased dramatically with the new tooling available.
And I know this community stays up to date with a lot of that AI news. So we would love to hear in the chat what you all are kind of concerned about in this age of AI when it comes to identity specifically. I know for me, Ray, I've talked a lot with folks like you and me who are very online. I have to imagine I have enough audio at this point to be completely convincingly duplicated audio-wise, and probably visually too, although I'm getting some reports in the comments that our camera's a little blurry today. We're having some Teams issues because Microsoft. Love you, Microsoft, but Teams is Teams in today. So if you're seeing anything blurry, that's on our side. We'll try to get that fixed. But, I think it just goes to show that there's a lot of different kinds of threats that we need to be aware of. So let us know in the chat what threats you're concerned about on the AI side. Code injection. You look at things like, AI becoming browser extensions that can just jump in there and parse anything. I don't mean to spook everybody, but it is the Halloween episode, so.
Yeah, and it's a scary topic, and we can dive into it more. But one, I want to blame my signal, by the way, on the outer rim. We do not get great reception out here, so I'll just throw that out. But the other thing to think about with AI, and we won't touch on it today, but threat actors using AI to mine data. That's something else that we've been starting to see an uptick in. And again, it's enhancing their capabilities as much as it's enhancing ours.
Well, maybe the Empire is really trying to get at our comms here today. We might have to keep an eye on that because you've got some really important information to share, Ray. This is coming from and I forgot to change the tag. I'm so sorry about that. But this is coming from Coveware's Q3 report. And if you go to veeam.com and go to our blog, the head of Coveware actually recently posted this amazing blog talking about a lot of the findings from the Q3 report. But Ray, why don't you give us a little taste of that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of insights in our quarterly reporting, and we always tend to look at this in terms of just overall trends. What's the impact of victims? What are threat actors doing? But a couple of things to highlight. So if you look at the median ransom payment dropping down, 140,000, six-figure range, that's 65% down from Q2. I will say most of the ransoms that we see typically paid in Coveware's cases, six-figure to mid to low seven. Now, a lot of that, of course, is indicative of the fact that many of these organizations have better preparedness, resilience, engagement with third parties like Coveware to help provide the right guidance. But again, we're making a dent in terms of the monetization of these campaigns. It's also interesting to note some of the high-profile campaigns that have been out there have not led to significant financial gain for threat actors. We can unwind that a little bit, but I think a lot more organizations much more resilient. But I think one of the most important things that's not on this slide that ties back to that is payment rates. I don't know if we have a separate one for this, but we hit an all-time low in terms of victims that actually paid 23%. Now, 2/3 of those still end up paying because they don't have a viable recovery path. They have to pursue a decryption key. But 23% all-time low, and in the trailing 7 quarters now, we've been between 23 to 35%. But that speaks to a host of things, including better prevention, better resilience, and of course, better response. We've also seen a significant evolution here in just the ransomware as a service. And we've continued to see this over the course of, let's say, the last 12 to 18 months. A lot less of these large, big game hunting groups of expansive numbers, and more so smaller actors, smaller groups, much more tight knit. Why? Because the risk profile is less, right? If you have hundreds of subscribers, easy for law enforcement to penetrate those operations. If you have a small subset of, say, 8, 10, or 12 individuals, you can keep it kind of close to the vest. But we've also seen a lot of novice actors, a lot of independent actors. And the challenge with this is we've seen a lot more of this shift from ransomware as a service to really more extortion as a service. Varied outcomes, volatility, unpredictability. In fact, many of those independent actors that organizations have dealt with, if they've chosen to pay for something like data suppression, 75% re-extortion coming out of that. So a lot of risk associated with that. There is no trust or honor amongst the collective thieves. And then lastly, hyper-focused on exfiltration. We look at our data, 89% of our cases in the quarter had encryption. Disruption is still a common component of many of our attacks. 85% had data exfiltration. And in fact, over 70% of our cases include both. Multi-front war, bifurcated attack. So as we're thinking about that, though, that data sprawl, everywhere that it exists, SaaS-based applications, cloud-based storage, on-premise locations, targets of opportunity for a threat actor. And candidly, they don't have to get as far in. So going back to our conversation about identity, I may just need a few sets of credentials or an OAuth token or something like that. Now I have access to that repository, download millions of records. And that's really what happened with that recent campaign against a large CRM provider. It wasn't a weakness in the CRM. Don't want to misconstrue that. It was using human manipulation and engineering techniques to get there. According to the threat actor, 1.6 billion records compromised over 760 organizations. That's a lot, and that's a huge amount of impact. Now, again, not monetizable, but from a brand reputation perspective, still very impactful.
Absolutely. And I think part of that too is the acceleration of those movements happening so quickly. I know in the 2024 Microsoft report, they said that when it came to cloud-based infiltration, they were finding an average time of just 4 hours. Yeah. Sitting in just one location. And that's where I think we need to get more creative with the signals. And I know that there can be signal fatigue for a lot of security teams, but something that I know the Covert team has seen and Veeam has seen is that oftentimes the backup infrastructure is getting attacked. So if you look for anomalous patterns in the backup activity, you may be able to get there faster, and speed is oftentimes the name of the game here. And that's actually something that our special guest speaker, who I had a chance to chat with a couple of weeks ago, wanted to impart on everyone. So I have a very special treat for the Industry Insights audience, whether you're, again, tuning in live or you're watching this as a recording. I had a chance to chat with our good friend Gabe over at Myata. He is the Chief Hacking Officer of Myata, and he has a ton of ethical hacking experience. He is a wealth of knowledge. I highly recommend linking up with him on social media platforms because he is constantly sharing interesting information. And, you know, he had some interesting insights from the other side in my chat. And let's just say, I think the empire is really trying to break in to these defenses. So let's take a look at what I had to chat about with Gabe.
Zero trust, Leah? How do you get zero trust in this economy? You can't have zero trust in this economy. I can't. Of course you can. So you were asking earlier in particular about how we protect against threats today that we may have solutions for, but ultimately in the future, those solutions may not be as adequate for. The answer to that does largely come wholly back to zero trust. Why does zero trust ensure future-proof protection against ethical hackers like myself? Well, the answer is you've got everything from AI deepfakes that makes it such that you can't actually tell if you're talking to the real Vader or Gabe Gums, the ethical hacker. And so a really good example of that is the following. We're on the horizon event for a mass decryption problem. The world has been encrypting their data largely with protocols that are not quantum resilient. And given what most experts think, we're somewhere between 5 and 15 years on the high side of stable quantum computing being able to decrypt data, right? And so you could ask yourself, well, how could I have future-proof that? The answer has actually always existed. Just as one example, although NIST has only standardized their quantum proof encryption controls over the last 5 years, there has been other techniques such as Shamir secret sharing, which gives you theoretical protections against quantum de-encryption, namely not having enough data there. The answer to this people, technology, and process problem is just one more layer below that, if you would. It's an architectural problem. how did we architect how we select the people? How did we architect the solutions, not just that responded to the problems, but the IT solutions themselves at the ground floor? And so even today, when I hear a lot about zero trust, you know what I hear? I hear zero trust networking. I hear zero trust applications. I hear zero trust in a lot of places, but I don't hear zero trust throughout the entire IT stack. Whether you're talking OSI layer, layers 1 through 8, or you're just talking network application storage, I still see major zero trust initiatives missing on the storage layers of these things. And so to that end, we will be, from this point forward, we will be levying a 300% tariff on all zero trust brought into the enterprise from this point forward.
I had so much fun on my chat with Gabe, as you can tell, and hopefully, if time permitting, we'll have another clip with Gabe as well. But I think one of the really interesting things that he made a point to talk about is how difficult it is to hit zero trust, right? He said zero trust in this economy, which of course is funny, but it's also valid, right? We hear from the vast majority of organizations that budget is flat year over year. You're dealing with a million different competing priorities, which should never be a plural concept. So I would love to hear from you all in the audience. What is the biggest challenge to adopting zero trust in your organization? Do you feel like it's a culture change issue? Is there a lot of tool sprawl, right? Ray talked earlier about how much of that heterogeneity and sprawl creates complications. So is that the big bugaboo? Are you having trouble with executive buy-in? And again, budget in this economy? Let us know in the chat what your big issue is. And Ray, I know you talk with a lot of organizations, especially anonymous ones. Can you share a little bit of insight about where their big hurdles have been?
I think the primary ones that I hear, one is on the culture change side, the security friction that gets created. And that's one of those things, too, that we try to make sure that our general audiences understand. Security friction is necessary because that friction of an extra click or two for you, or maybe a few extra seconds to authenticate or log in, that means the world of difference between a threat actor easily getting into the system and not. And so, again, that's a component sometimes depending on how these are implemented. And the other thing is I think overall, just making sure from an asset management inventory perspective that all equals all. So if I'm rolling this solution out to the point of, have I covered everything? Because even that 1% gap, if we have 99% coverage, well, that 1% gap is still exploitable, whether it's a set of accounts or a set of assets. And I think getting the necessary budget and resources to make sure that ring fencing is inclusive of the entire battlefield, often a challenge for many CISOs and CIOs trying to take this path.
And I think that challenge is something we're super passionate about. I know earlier this year, I had the pleasure of being part of our data resilience maturity model rollout. And I wanted to talk a bit again, because I know we talk about it on every show, but I wanted to share a bit of a different perspective. One of the things that we were able to do with McKinsey & Company is survey 500 organizations at that CIO and CISO level. And we found that CIOs, especially within that cohort, were wildly overconfident about their capabilities. 30% of CIOs thought that they would be higher than they ended up being on our data resilience maturity model. And a big part of that we find comes down to siloed and fragmented teams. 52% of organizations in our risk to resilience report from earlier this year noted that that was one of their major hurdles. And overall, of the 500 organizations that took the DRMM assessment to start, 74% of them fell below where they would need to be in order to stay resilient in the face of today's threats, all of the scary, stats that we just shared earlier and all of the TTP changes that we're seeing. But Ray, as you know, there is a new hope. I had to play with the lightsaber again. For those who don't know, if you joined late, we are doing a Star Wars themed episode because it is, of course, Halloween. And I am dressed up as General Leia Organa. Ray is my good friend, the not scruffy looking nerf herder. playing our Han Solo character. And one of the things that we got to do behind the scenes before Veeam was help put together what DRMM looks like. So if you haven't been able to join a show before and hear me talk about this, one of the core principles of the data resilience maturity model is zero trust. And it plays into so many different areas. Not only is it a technical concept, we talk a lot about immutable storage and multi-factor authentication and 4 eyes. But we also take a look at it from a data strategy perspective. What does your data governance look like? Who has access to what? Are people and processes in place? And I know when you, me, and our good friend Chewbacca, Charles, who couldn't join us today, when we were putting the show together, that was the big thing we kept harping on. I don't want anyone to think that there's ever going to be a panacea. And no one on this audience would ever think that, but I am sure that you've had an executive thinking, what is the one thing I can buy to make this problem go away? There isn't one. And instead it comes down to cultural changes. But the only way you can do that is know where you're starting, having that honest conversation. And I know from the first set of data resilience maturity workshops that we've done, nearly all of them are falling into Horizon 1, which is reactive and limited in capabilities. So, Ray, can you talk a little bit about kind of some of those core principles that went into DRMM, especially looking at other cybersecurity frameworks that we were pulling from?
Yeah, I think it goes back to, if you look at that kind of that overconfidence we were talking about, a lot of that overconfidence isn't because the CIO is naive. It's what are we measuring against? What's that benchmark that we really should be working towards, where we actually have an industry view of what is the right things to focus on? And if you don't have that, we're kind of all over the map in terms of decentralization of those frameworks, well, then it becomes a bit of a challenge to truly measure where you are. And so I think if you look at that overconfidence translating into this is about providing a consistent component of how do we actually measure our resilience as it relates to this along a maturity curve that we can always constantly reevaluate and evolve. Because that's the other thing to note. This is a life cycle. It is a journey. It's not a one and done. To your point, Leah, it's not a single technology. It's not a single tool. And it's not even a single process that will get us there. But we have to go back and we have to look again and again and continue to measure ourselves against these benchmarks to say, what's next? Where can I now improve? And also doing so while not letting the other things fall to waste. I think an interesting analogy, if we kind of look at kind of organizations that have gone through breaches. One, I would say arguably almost all of them are like, hey, we were prepared for this until we weren't, right? It's like every great plan until you get punched in the mouth kind of thing. And even in my own past breaches, a lot of the questions that came back was like, didn't you do tabletops? Didn't you do audits? Didn't you? Yes, we did all those. But the question is, are we asking ourselves the right questions? But then the other thing is several years removed, do we have something to look back to say we did the right things and we continue to do the right things even as our resources and our priorities change? Because there's also a tendency for entropy and decay to enter into this space. And over time, the things that we did 3 years ago were less effective. And of course, those cracked the foundation, and now we find ourselves in that place again. So a lot of the concept behind DRMM was providing a consistent model where we could map that for growth, but also sustainability as we're thinking about how we actually think about resilience as it relates to data.
I think one of the really exciting things too about DRMM is it's a drumbeat. It's an assessment that you can take again and again over time to see how you improve. And it's also most effective when you're building consensus across the organization. We try our best to always invite leaders from both IT and cybersecurity teams. And Ray, I'm sure you can attest to this, but we find that they are very rarely on the same page when it comes to these assessments. We do a lot of those radial diagrams, and the dots are not on the same page. And that's okay, right? Again, I think those friction points are necessary in order to figure out where you can come together and build that action plan, that 30, 60, 90 and beyond, to continuously make those improvements. And fortunately, you're not alone in that. I think the assessment's a great place to start, but it's got to come down to laying that foundation and then making those improvements and putting those practices in place. So, our next episode that we wanted to talk about is the return of recovery. This idea that it's really important to be not only recognizing what your risk exposure is, but then also looking at how you can mitigate that. So one of the things that a few of our experts have put together is this risk framework that bakes into a program that we're going to talk about in just a second. But it comes down to what is the collection of technical capabilities, people and process changes, looking up at the sky at our data strategy to figure out how you can identify risk, assess that risk continuously, mitigate that risk, and then overall monitor your entire environment. So those are the 4 things I want everyone to think about: identify, assess, mitigate, and continuously monitor. And I think that's really the core concepts within our Veeam Cyber Secure program. Now, if you've heard us talk about this before, this is not your mom's jeans anymore. We actually had a big update to the Veeam Cyber Secure program, and secretly, that's the whole reason we wanted to do a cybersecurity show this month, besides the fact that it is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We are really big fans of Veeam Cyber Secure on the Industry Insights show, especially because it is one of the best ways that you get to engage with the amazing knowledge of the Coveware team. So, Ray, can you tell us a little bit about Veeam Cyber Secure, what Coveware does, and then especially how we thought about the repackaging that ultimately became part of this launch?
Absolutely. And by the way, I would love to call this the Revenge of Recovery. And for those of you Star Wars nerds who know the title issue with Return of the Jedi versus Revenge of the Jedi. But as we think about Veeam Cyber Secure, a couple pieces. One, Coveware is just a component of this. There's a remarkable team between Veeam and Cast and others that are all supporting this. But when we thought about Veeam Cyber Secure and what would work for the clients and work for the customers, we want to make sure that there was a foundational component of Veeam Cyber Secure that was really broadly accessible to all Veeam customers. What do I mean by that? Well, this is a component of looking at what is the architecture of your Veeam backup environments? Are they architected securely when you deploy? Because keep in mind, we're going to deliver secure solutions, but we also want to make sure in the implementation that we make sure all the right steps are taken and the diligence is there. There's quarterly security assessments to come in and make sure, again, are we aligned to this on a consistent basis, and are we sustaining those controls quarter over quarter? Because those gaps and those cracks over time, we know the threat actors are using those to get into the organization itself. And we're also providing things such as incident response toolkits as part of this. This is a Coveware construct supported by Veeam to help enable the teams to kind of look at their incident response plans with a critical eye. Have we included all the components that we need to? What are the questions we should ask ourselves if we get into this issue? And also, do we have an avenue to those response resources that we need between Veeam and Coveware if this issue were to arise? I'm not going to say inevitably or when, but again, if that unnecessary attack occurs, do we have a recourse there? And building something there that, again, extends to all Veeam customers, the ability to consume that, very, very important, because what we really want to do is elevate everyone to the same level of security, because if we can do that, we can make a significant dent in the impact of these attacks overall. And we still have that Veeam Cyber Secure Premium for those at the upper tiers of their maturity who want that direct retainer with Coveware, who want additional resources through Veeam, including that technical account manager and so forth. But again, as we're looking at this, we want to really take the entire Veeam customer base and elevate them to a secure posture so we all collectively feel confident in where we're positioned.
You know, years ago, the Industry Insights show was hosted by some of my dear friends in the product strategy organization, and they always had this mantra, this wish that we want to see the number of organizations paying a ransom go down. And Ray just talked about that earlier. We're seeing that. And I hope that you can hear how passionate and excited we are to bring a lot of these best practices to as many organizations as possible, because cybersecurity shouldn't just be for the elite. It needs to be for absolutely every organization. So I'm really excited about this change. It's definitely something that all current Veeam customers should be taking a look at, especially when it comes to that checklist piece, because I'm a big fan of what gets measured gets done. If anyone comes from an agile background, that's, of course, one of your big mantras. And whenever I've heard in the field organizations who get to know the Veeam Cyber Secure program, that's actually one of the number one things the leaders and executives get excited about, because boy, do they love to like whip something around and say, did this thing get done? Hashtag let me know in the comments if you have any overdue trainings from your HR department or IT team or GRC team. I'm sure I have a number of them in my inbox right now. I just came back from PTO. Sorry. But, I think that checklist piece, it's a really big part of it. So definitely take a look if you're an organization who currently uses Veeam, because it's basically a lighthouse of how you can get to a better place, a more resilient place as an organization. But of course, backup, recovery, zero trust architecture are all really important components, but cybersecurity is a bigger landscape, and we're starting to see IT and security come together in much more of a delectable sandwich than it ever was separately. And as part of that, I wanted to get one more poll out there with the community before we start kind of wrapping things up with some exciting announcements if you haven't heard. So before we do that, I wanted to hear from everyone, especially knowing this is a hardcore backup community oftentimes, when it comes to understanding your organization's data posture. Would you say that you've really done things well? Do you even know what data posture means? Does IT or security have it covered? Does anyone even know what data security posture should look like? Ray, obviously I know what we're heading towards talking about here, but I think the data security posture management space is a really interesting one that we've been seeing develop for a while now as a category. And as somebody who works with a lot of organizations on processes and procedures and governance and data strategy, is this something you're hearing more organizations talking about?
Absolutely. And honestly, even before I came to Coveware, I had led huge data governance projects inside large enterprises. And now as data exfiltrations become the forefront, understanding where my data is, what is in my data, and so forth becomes critical. So we're seeing a lot of organizations now focus on this. And I think one of the biggest questions often comes down to that starting point of where is it and what is it? And I think that visibility is something that a lot of organizations have struggled with, but I don't want to steal the lead on this. I think it's something we can talk about in a second. So
absolutely. And with that, I think that concept of intelligence is coming to the brain. So episode 4, Intelligence Awakens. If I were to think of any equivalence of what the force would look like in our space, it should be intelligence. It should be, what do we know about our data? How well do we know it? Where can we find it? Do a lot of people know about it? Is it something that we all do more than just believe in with a hope and a prayer? Is it actually like the wind, where we all can agree it does in fact exist? So I think that intelligence piece is what will become that next big evolution of what we want to see Veeam talk about. So if you hadn't heard the news, Veeam is acquiring a company called Security AI. And these are two leaders in their categories, DPSM and data resilience, coming together to try to bring something stronger to the market. I hope you guys have had a chance to hear about this from the Veeam team. If you follow us on social media, it's flooded your social media. I'm sure you've seen our CEO Anand talk about it quite a bit. And we are beyond excited to invite the security IT team, AI team, to be coming on board to Veeam. And a big part of that is what they're bringing to the table. The data command graph, this idea that you can get a better sense of what your data is doing. You can understand data everywhere, regardless of where it sits. And you can get to that level of precision, which in an era of AI, both AI threats and AI and all of the positive ways that we're bringing it to market, I think it's just going to be a huge, exciting time for everyone who is in the Veeam ecosystem. And if you're wondering, what is a data command graph? Well, on this show, we are always here to bring those foundational definitions. So, security's unique data command graph is, they describe it like a social network of data, and everything's associated with an object. So whether that's files, tables, columns, streams, models, you name it, it's able to understand it, identify it, and you're able to interact with it and see it on a grander scale. Something we talked about earlier is this idea that Entra ID or Active Directory, any identity and access management system, becomes one of the critical ways that you can recover in the event of a disaster. It is the primary way that in a zero trust architecture where you have put assume breach principles everywhere, it's the way that you can identify whether or not something can be restored. So keeping that context, the connective tissue in mind is so critical. That's, I think, a good way to think about this overall concept of what a data command graph can give you. Ray, I'm super excited to talk about this. I'm super excited to learn more about it too. I think we'll cover how you can learn more about it in a little bit, but any kind of words about this other than yay?
Yeah, I share the excitement, and I kind of go, let's tie back to the data breaches and that kind of thing. Some of the biggest headwinds for a lot of organizations is understanding between the structured and the unstructured. Unstructured particularly, what's in there? So if something was actually breached, something was actually taken, how do I dimensionalize the impact, the risk of exposure, and so forth? Because I can't trust a threat actor to tell me. So again, getting this kind of level of insight and intelligence, I think, is going to be critical. It's going to be something a lot of organizations have struggled to get in the past. So I'm excited for the future. There's a lot still to be written on this story, but I look forward to coming back when we can and talking more about it. So.
Absolutely. And part of how we're going to be doing that is really bringing it into context of data resilience all up. So let's bring it back to some basics first. We built some really cool excitement, but let's bring it back here. This idea of data resilience, the rise of data resilience. Mm-hmm. Ray, I'm sure you've heard this before whenever you've brought Veeam into a conversation. Veeam is just backup, right? And it is backup. It is recovery, but data resilience becomes such a bigger conversation for organizations. So let's just break down a couple of the key points here that we've talked about, right? Assume breach, prepare for impact, I think is one of the big things that we always want to communicate effectively. Validate what was taken. Don't trust the attacker's word. I think a lot of what was covered in the Q3 report speaks to that. Segment fast and recover faster. A lot of what we talked about was those lateral movements, not only the sprawl of those movements, but the time spent in each location is dramatically changing. So thinking ahead in what that recovery scenario looks like in the speed and breadth and complexity is key. Being able to move from reactive to programmatic, right? People and process was so much of what we talked about. And there's no easy buttons, just tested trust that works. Tabletop exercises, so key. Ray, any other, kind of best practices that we really want to share with everyone?
So not so much additional, but I just want to tease out 3 of these real quick. Assume compromise. That doesn't mean defeatist attitude. It means assume that they're going to get past the outside layer of your defenses and get in, and then what? So I see a lot of red teams and penetration tests are like, well, but they had access to a laptop. We gave them credentials. Well, guess what? That's what the threat actors are going to do as well. So when we say assume compromise, assume they've gotten through that perimeter, and then what happens next? Segment fast, recover faster. This is hopefully a situation a lot of organizations don't have to be put into, but how quickly can you contain and eradicate that early stage? Because sometimes that self-deprecation and bringing services offline might be the fastest way to actually recover safely. It's a hard decision to make in the moment. And then the last one about no tricks, no easy buttons, just tested. You got to exercise the muscle. It has to be more than once a year in different ways, shapes, and form, and involve all those teams like we talked about. It can't just be a security-specific exercise or an IT-specific exercise or the backup team exercise. Pull them together. Put them in a room, because you don't want the first time that those teams collaborating to be in the moment in an event. You want them to have some trust and karma amongst each other when that event occurs. So it's going to be much more effective and much more positive in terms of outcomes.
And that is hard to do, of course. So let the Veeam team know how we can help you broker those relationships, build that consensus within your organization, because as you saw from one of our earlier slides, 52% of organizations say siloed teams are the biggest thing getting in their way of data resilience. So you're not alone if you're frustrated. Let the Veeam team come in and help. We can hopefully give you some talking points to elevate this conversation and fight for it within your organization, and give you some really cool things to do in person to break apart, assess, checklist, improve, make the bosses happy, all the good things. And speaking of that, if you do want to get some of those talking points and to hear about the latest innovations, boy, do we have a great show for you, because on November 19th or November 20th for our friends in Asia Pacific, we are going to have a global launch event. And this is a virtual event, so anyone can attend. We want to really prepare everyone for 2026 by looking at how Veeam is helping you simplify operations, fortify security, and ultimately improve your data resilience as an organization. I have seen some of the sessions. I am pumped for some of the things that we are announcing, so I can't stress enough. Please sign up for this event. Our production team is going to put the link to it in the chat. Please sign up. It'll be the best way that you can hear more about that security AI announcement and actually see, what we're talking about here. And then we'll also talk about some of those other launch pieces, including some exciting Microsoft 365 pieces, V13. There's plenty to come. Ray, any last words, though, before we wrap today's Star Wars themed show?
I mean, honestly, I'm just excited. I think I'm excited about everything that Veeam has for our customers and our clients. There's a lot of opportunity here between the DRMM, the new reimagining of VCS, which I think is really going to resonate with a lot of our customers, and of course, what's to come with security. So I think mic drop moment, we've already kind of teed it up. It's a combination of everything we talked about today. So
definitely. And, I've been with Veeam off and on for almost 15 years. I've been here since version 7. And our tagline used to be Veeam, it just works. And it does. But what's really cool is that we're recognizing that Veeam, the tool may work, but we're just this big of a much bigger puzzle. And I'm so excited to see everything else that we're bringing to these organizations, people, process, tech, aligning to strategy. There's a lot of really great, exciting stuff coming. So stay tuned for that global launch event. And on our next show, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk more about identity threats and what it means for that supply chain of your whole data stack. So tune in for that next show. Otherwise, thank you all so much for joining us, and may the force be with you.